Hello, welcome to this video, and this video is going to be called the English Aesthetic Part 2. And on this video I'm going to now try and explain, following on from the video where I really tried to define what I thought the English aesthetic was, I'm going to try and explain how that aesthetic then integrates itself into rock and roll in the 60s and sort of takes over rock and roll, which turns it into what I would call rock music, which then becomes progressive rock music, which then becomes punk, electronic music, dance music. All this music as thou is just dripping with the thing that I call the English aesthetic. It's something that nobody ever talks about, and I'm going to really try and explain how that happened and where and why it happened on this video. So shall we go back to a little piece of English culture from pre-rock music era? Shall we do that? I've pulled out an album here from my collection. It's called Songs for Swinging Sellers, right? And it is by the comedian who was a member of the Goons, right? It's a very old album. That album's well over 60 years old. Peter Sellers. It was recorded, I think, around about 1958, I imagine. 1959, right? On this album, we have a number of comedy songs by this comedian, Peter Sellers, right? Peter Sellers, I think, is iconic in terms of English culture because of his work in The Goons, and then later on his film career where he created characters like the Pink Panther. Right, what we have here is a parody of American culture. This is spoofing what you would see on a Frank Sinatra album. Right, I think Frank Sinatra made an album called Songs for Swinging Lovers, and here we have that, you know, aping American culture. We have the Wanted poster with Peter Sellers on, and someone's obviously caught him. They put the record on, and the swinging, very dark humour, the swinging is him hung from a tree swinging. This is dark British surrealistic humour parodying American culture, right? So let's have that as a starting point. I'm actually going to play you a track off here because it really shows, I think, where we're going to start. It's a track off side 2, and it's called Putting on the Smile. Right, so I'll just put this on for you. This album is 60 years old, so it might be a little bit crackly.
Anyone got a fan? So, is this bird showing up yet? Oh, no, he's here, isn't it?
Well, I'm now in the studio and I'm about to meet the famous Lenny Gunnigan. He's standing just to the left of me here, looking very smart in a silk suit and cashmere cummerbund. Isn't that right, Gunnigan?
I don't want no autographs, if you don't mind, man.
I don't quite understand. I would just like to interview you.
I'm always going to meet the press, because the public I can't stand. You understand that I can't stand? It's like this way, man. I was working on a railroad, man, and I couldn't stand the public.
Did you personally discover folk music?
Well, I wouldn't go that far, man, but you can say that until I come along, there was only a lot of bohemians singing in cellars. All they was doing was singing this music, man.
And now?
Well, there's a lot of bohemians and me, man.
Well, it's very interesting. And are you anything to do perhaps with rock and roll?
Rock and roll? No, I'm a folk singer, man. I sing blues, dad, you see, I work songs for the people and the peasants. That's what I sing, because they're working on a railroad, you understand?
Very well put, especially wearing a 50-guinea suit. Do you travel widely to collect these songs of yours, Mr. Gunnigan?
Oh yes, every Saturday I go down Devil's Jazz Record Shop and I collect all the latest folk stuff, you know, around the world in 80 days, all this. And all I like to have the records that go round, you see?
In the jazz books, they talk about the Deep South, where all this happens. Have you been to the Deep South?
Well, I've been all over, man. You see, I've been Brighton, Portsmouth, Truro, Penzance. I've been all over. I go everywhere in my travels, all over the place. Especially to all over.
Now, you have a song that's number 1 over here at this very moment. Where did you discover that one, for example?
Well, it was an obscure folk song hidden at the top of the American Hit Parade, and I made it famous by cutting out all the verses and having one long chorus. Like, putting on the star, of course, putting on, and one long chorus was working on a railroad.
That's very fascinating.
And I've just finished work on another song called Land of Hope and Glory.
Surely Land of Hope and Glory, that's a well-known piece, isn't it?
Caught on quick there, clever dick. Hum the chorus.
Well, I don't really hum.
Can you believe that, boy? Oh, that's funny, check out.
Yes,
You see, every time I get a picture of the place, I know the song at the end. I'll be working on the chorus. See, I'm putting on the chorus in the cinema on a style. Hey, I'm working in the cinema on the railroad in a style. I'm working in the style on the railroad in the cinema. Hey, I'm putting on. Hey, putting on.
Well, I think I'll leave it to get on with it. Goodbye.
Well, there was a man who was working on a railroad, and he was working away on this here railroad, and he got a little old hammer, and he kept hitting them wheels, because he was working on a railroad. As I said, he was just hitting away and working on a railroad, hitting away them wheels with his hammer. Suddenly one day when I was hitting away them wheels on the railroad with his old hammer, hitting away and wheeling and hammering and wheeling, fella come up and says, "What you doing, man?" He says, "I'm hitting these wheels with my little hammer." He says, "You don't want to hit them wheels. You want to be careful when you're hitting them, because you've been hitting my leg some of the time." So he said, "Hey, man, I never did that with your leg. I thought that was a wheel." He said, "Man, I've got a wheel that's shaped just like a leg, or the other way around, whichever you prefer." He said, "Man, I just don't care a damn, as long as I've got something to hit." Then he go tapping a little bit more, and then he stopped tapping. "No, you try and get them taps in as I tell you, man." Well, here we go. John Henry come down from Washington one long hot summer day to bring some water for Sylvie, or was it Nellie Gray? He put away his hammer and popped his chewing gum. But Sylvie didn't.
Right, so sorry to play you all of that, but I think it really makes my point. Right, what we have here is this surrealist English humour lampooning a musician that emerged in the 1950s called Lonnie Donegan. And Lonnie Donegan became world famous, well, very famous in the UK, by doing a very British version of American folk music, you know, tunes by people by like Lead Belly. This movement was called Skiffle, and Skiffle became really famous. And the reason why it caught on is because anybody could play it. You didn't even have to really have an instrument. You know, musicians would build their instruments out of household objects. So people would get an old washboard and they scratch that for the drums. You know, people would get a broom handle and tie a piece of string to it and put it on a tea chest, and they'd bend it back and pluck it, and that would give them a bass. And if you had an acoustic guitar, you could start to make this music. And what this did, there's a whole bunch of English musicians fired up by this sort of almost like punk approach to making music that started to create Skiffle. And these musicians basically went on into the music industry in the 1960s. Jimmy Page, there's a famous video of Jimmy Page at a very young age being interviewed about the Skiffle craze because he was a Skiffle musician. Jeff Beck was into Skiffle. The Beatles were formed as the Quarrymen as a Skiffle band. You know, John Lennon meets Paul McCartney in the world of Skiffle, and Lonnie Donegan was the guy that did this, right? So what we have here is a very British surreal critique of the way British people were taking in American culture into the country, right? Now, if you look at the details, I tried to show you this. Here, there's a little photo, I put it up here. Here we have Peter Sellers making the album, and sat to his right, we've got Ron Goodman, the great orchestral arranger, you know, and then to his right, we have a very young George Martin. George Martin learned his skills at EMI, making these comedy albums for the Goons and for Peter Sellers. This required a skill level that was much higher than making a normal album, because he would have to use the technology of the time to try and stitch together a piece like that, which is why I wanted you to play it, where you've got a band playing, somebody singing but also talking, and then actors pretending to be, you know, an interviewer, and all that has to be stitched together in the studio, right? And so George Martin was learning skills that were beyond what you'd normally expect just to record your run-of-the-mill stuff. So here we have with this the embryo of everything that is going to be applied onto American rock and roll in the 60s, okay? Now, there's another great comedian at the time that was really reinventing and creating situation comedy at that time. There was a comedian called Tony Hancock. And with his Hancock's Half Hour, he really basically creates the idea of the sitcom, which puts a personality that's trodden down by the world, but is trying to lift themselves up at the centre of the comedic, structure of that programme. That's basically the basis of all situation comedy, right up to Seinfeld, all that stuff really has its roots with Hancock. In 1960s, Tony Hancock made a film called The Rebel. And in The Rebel, we see, again, this sort of surrealist, self-deprecating view of what art is. It's the story of this English guy that's trapped in a mundane job, 9 to 5. He joins on the train every single morning. He goes and sits on a desk with a load of people that look exactly like him, all little automatons in this sort of modernist world. And he wishes to escape that through art. But of course, he's terrible, right? That's the joke, he's terrible. And he goes to France where he meets these sort of existentialist, postmodernist characters, and he tries to integrate themselves, but he undoes it with his Englishness, and he actually, by mistake, gets mistaken for another painter, and he then becomes an imposter in the art scene. And you see all the pretensions and yet the sort of insecurities all bound together, right? And what I love about this film, The Rebel, is it shows the shifts culturally that's happening as people move from the 1950s and they no longer want to be part of the machine, the modernist machine. They don't want to do the 9 to 5. They don't want to wear the same suits that their parents wore when they went to the same jobs. They want to escape that through self-expression. But at the same time, what Hancock does is he undoes it, and he shows it up for the pretentiousness that it is. The scene when he goes to the existentialist party is everything you need to know about what is culturally now gripping us, this sort of postmodern neo-Marxist view of the world which has subsumed everything. Go and watch that pulled apart by Hancock as you sort of get that English small simple person's view of the world integrating with this sort of highfalutin pretentious view which at that time was the idea of high art, right? Hopefully you can see that the what I call the English aesthetic here, which is this surrealistic, self-deprecating humour, is now going to be applied and married in to rock and roll. Okay, so when we start to see the bands that are emerging in the early 60s, bands like the Kinks and the Beatles and the Rolling Stones, you will see the same application where those idealistic visceral tendencies in rock and roll are now tempered with something else, where there's a sort of very English reservedness that is now sat back going, well, I don't know what we think about all this leaping about and all this rock and roll. We can do it if we have to, but I don't know. And I think that is the element that emerges in the Beatles, right? So what we have, this sort of slightly sneering, self-deprecating approach that the Beatles have, which basically what it is they're not falling for the sort of, well, rock and roll stars, Little Richard, Elvis Presley, Jerry Lee Lewis. They're all larger than life figures. Elvis Presley is like the best looking guy you've ever seen. He can sing, he can dance, he stands up, all the women want him. Right? This has come from an American culture of the film star. It's the idea of the star, the entertainer, is wrought right in the middle of American culture. The Beatles start off by basically trying to play like Little Richard and Chuck Berry, but they're working class guys, just normal people. They're just normal people. They're not the best looking people in the world. They're not the best musicians in the world. They're just normal guys with this unique take. And when they go to America, what people see are real people. And people who have loved rock and roll, loved Elvis Presley, they look at them, right? And what we have is the seeds of that skiffle. It allows entrance into this world. Suddenly anybody can do this. Oh my God, look at Ringo on the drums. Look at how cool he is. You know, and Ringo's not the best looking person in the world. He's smiling and he's having fun. And then when they're interviewed, they have the same humour because, you see, the Beatles grew up on this stuff, right? They loved this. This is wound into the music. And what the world sees are just four regular people, just normal people, making brilliant music, right? But it makes people feel that they can be a part of that. It opens up, it's inclusive, right? It's inclusive. It's not exclusive like Elvis Presley. Elvis is incredible, but he's exclusive. Little Richard is exclusive. These are like people from another planet. The Beatles and then the Rolling Stones and then the Kinks and the Small Faces, all these British bands aren't like that. They're regular people, right? But they bring to it a love and understanding of rock and roll and Afro-American music, but they also bring directly in the cultural sounds of Englishness. Lonnie Donegan, we really have to say, is the beginning of it. But there's also, think some of the traditional jazz guys, like people like Humphrey Lyttelton. Oh, my mind's gone blank now. When I can't think of something, it's gone. But I think the trad guys from the 40s and early 50s as well, they're all laying the groundwork from this. And I think, I can't remember his name. This is what happens when you get older. One of the traditional jazz musicians, he starts bringing in blues artists from America, and British musicians start to see that. And I think what's really interesting is this idea of inclusivity, the idea of that has suddenly emerged in the 1960s culturally, where you want to hear other voices, you want to get a different point of view. Of course, the point of views of your sort of itinerant 1930s rural blues musicians is so almost like alien to, you know, English, you know, musicians, that they open their arms to it and they bring that in. And is it Cyril Davis? One of the traditional jazz guys. Oh, this is terrible. This is what happens when you just make this stuff up as you go along. You can't always pull the facts. But those tours where they brought in Howling Wolf and Muddy Waters, they're very important. Also, what's really important, and it's lampooned, I wanted to try and find it on one of these albums. On one of these albums, and I cannot find it. I don't know whether it's on this one, where Peter Sellers takes the mickey out of Larry Parnes. And Larry Parnes was the first great rock and roll manager. And seeing the success of Elvis Presley, he started to sign up a whole host of sort of working class English, you know, boys, who he renamed with fantastical names like Marty Wilde and Billy Fury. And he basically then brought in the cream of American rock and roll, people like Eddie Cochran and Gene Vincent, and he put together tours. And I think those tours, along with the blues tours that were put on in the early 60s, that influence on English musicians that were open and ready, and then the integration of this thing called the English aesthetic into that, which I'm going to explain in a minute how that happened. That is basically the groundwork of rock music, right? Now, I've got to admit a personal connection to Larry Parnes in that my wife's father-in-law was a singer called Peter Wynn, and Peter Wynn was signed up by Larry Parnes, and Pete actually toured on those tours. He performed alongside Gene Vincent and Eddie Cochran, and my father-in-law was actually there when, you know, Eddie jumped into the car on the way to Bristol and then had a car crash along with Gene Vincent and died in that crash. He was there when all that happened. Sadly, my father-in-law died a couple of years ago, but when he was alive, it was an absolute, for me, fountain of knowledge to have actually talked to someone that was there at the beginning of the development of rock and roll and rock music in Britain, and actually find out how that worked and piece that together, and also playing with Robert Plant and other musicians that are around that scene. I've been able to really get a good picture of what was going on, especially in London in the early 60s, that really moves rock and roll towards rock music. And it really was a melting pot of musicians taking and embracing American culture but making it their own. Now, I'm going to try and describe how that happened by picking a really unlikely band, right? And I think some of the viewers outside the UK might not know this band, but I'm going to pick on a band that didn't do this project in the same way as Cream or Led Zeppelin or Jeff Beck or Yes or Genesis or Jethro Tull. They did it in an entirely different way. And I want to talk about the band Chas and Dave. And Chas and Dave is going to be my case study of how English and British musicians integrated American music into their form. So Chas and Dave in the 80s had a bunch of hit records with a genre that they sort of almost invented, and it's this sort of Cockney sing-along genre, which sounds very, very English. They had hit records with tunes like Rabbits, absolutely brilliant stuff. I absolutely love Chas and Dave. Now Chas and Dave actually emerged as session musicians in the 60s. They were part of that scene we were talking about, and they were really enamoured with American rock and roll, primarily Jerry Lee Lewis and that sort of piano approach, right? As they're playing this, they get involved in a lot of soul and rhythm and blues. Anyone who has heard the record My Name Is by Eminem, which is a real big slice of sort of relatively modern American culture, that track is actually created from a sample from a British soul rhythm and blues artist called Labi Siffre. Go and check it out. And in the middle section, they drop into this incredible groove that Dr. Dre then sampled for that Eminem track. Now, the musicians that came up with that groove were English musicians working on the session scene. And the keyboardist on that track, I assume he's a keyboardist. Anyway, Chas from Chas and Dave was one of the musicians that created the groove from which Eminem's My Name Is was made. Now, don't you think that's incredible that Chas was able to create such a funky American groove? But it's quite logical because this guy understands American music. So he's working in that genre. And he starts to ask himself a question which many British musicians ask themselves. We are aping American music. How honest is that? How can we integrate this American aesthetic with an English aesthetic? Right? So what Chas and Dave do is they take the sort of musical sing-along which they would have grown up in London, where everyone sits around a piano and they sing Roll Out the Barrel. But they drop that into a sound that is directly derived from Jerry Lewis. If you actually listen to what Chas and Dave are doing a lot of the time, it is American rock and roll. But those two forms integrate perfectly. And I think the reason is because the concepts and ideas that are contained in American music, right, are the same ideas that are contained within the English aesthetic in English music. And there's a humour and there's a partiness, there's a not taking yourself seriously. So it's the very thing that they're doing when Peter Sellers is taking the mickey out of Lonnie Donegan on this. It's there all the way through. And when you put those two forms together, Chas and Dave actually create a new type of music, right? Chas and Dave was beloved by the cognoscenti of the rock royalty. You know, Led Zeppelin had Chas and Dave supporting them at Nebworth, right? So that process that you see with Chas and Dave is identical to the process that emerges within bands like the Kinks, with bands like the Beatles and the Small Faces. All those bands I just mentioned, and the Who, right, and to some extent the Rolling Stones, although the Rolling Stones are far more enamoured by American music forms. But with the bands I mentioned before, you see them taking the rock and roll sound that was developed by artists signed up by Larry Parnes, developed by artists like Cliff Richard and the Shadows, which was much more guitar derived. And here in England, I think everything's far more guitar derived. And I think the reason for that is because most musicians had come up in that skiffle era. They hadn't come out playing saxophones in big bands. They weren't that type of musicians. They were musicians that had played guitar in skiffle bands. So the guitar is more important, right? there is, in the early 60s, a whole bunch of musicians that are exploring the guitar, and they see the guitar as being the embodiment of American culture. There's so many stories that I've heard of my musician friends, you know, going down to a shop in their local town and staring at the window and looking at a Fender Strat, you know, and thinking, oh my God, that's what Buddy Holly played, right? But what's really interesting here in the UK is that a drum teacher called Jim Marshall, who has a little shop and is selling stuff, realizes there's you know, an opening for selling amps. So he starts to I think he gets the wiring diagram for a Vox AC30, and he decides to create an amp. And there's a young guy coming down there, got a young guitarist called Pete Townsend, has a drummer in their band who's having lessons with Jim Marshall. And he says, oh, what, you know, why don't you make a guitar amp like this? You know, a great big amp, big 100-watt amp with a gain. Oh, why do you want a gain? Because we can turn it up and we can get this dirty, distorted sound. This sound that they've heard on, you know, rock and roll records coming out of America, you know, tracks like The Hustle that have come out of America in the late 50s. And so they want to get that sound. They want to have it on the amp. Everyone's trying to get it out of them Fox AC30s, and they're sticking pencils in the speakers. And Jim Marshall provides that guitar sound. So suddenly these rock and roll bands have this aggressive, middly guitar sound that transmits so well on a record. And we have these early rock records, you know, I think in the Kinks, and then we have, you know, Clapton, you know, with the Blues Breakers, adding distortion, and the Cream. But all these bands, they do the very thing that Chaz and Dave do. And what they do is they start to integrate elements of the English aesthetic. You know, a part of that is the sort of surreal humour that we get from the Goons, this sort of self-deprecation that we get, that I played you on today, you know, where they're sort of taking the mickey out of stuff. We get a love of the English landscape, a love of the expansive pastoral sounds of Vaughan Williams. That starts to get wound in, especially to progressive rock. You know, musicians suddenly want to have orchestras on their records like the Moody Blues. You know, we get, which has always been a part of English culture, because remember, we are a mongrel race and we've opened our arms up to so many different things out there. You know, I had a great conversation with someone on the channel after the first video when we talked about the idea of the curry, which is a very English thing. It's an English take on Indian food, but the food that you get in an Indian takeaway in the UK, that's entirely an English invention. So we get this opening of arms to other cultures. That Indian thing actually starts to come into British music, and we see Jeff Beck feed back in his guitar, you know, with the Yardbirds to try and emulate a sitar. With a big opening up of all these things that start to come in to the music, you know, you know, literary allusions, you know, the idea of the romantic poetry, the idea of the Byron-esque character. That there's so much within English art and the English aesthetic that then gets integrated. It's really difficult to talk about it, and I could spend the whole of this video just listing that. But when you think about bands like Pink Floyd, and then Jethro Tull and Soft Machine, and then King Crimson, we can see more and more British musicians integrating their own culture, which I call the English aesthetic, into this rock and roll project. This gives birth to what we could, in a very wide sense, call progressive music. David Bowie, T-Rex, you know, a whole host of artists that we no longer call progressive, you know, are in this project that's going on. And the musicians, I think, really start to explore this more and more. But the more you integrate these non-Afro-American ideas into the music, the more you move away from rock and roll, the very visceral form that had excited people, you know. And when you get the magic mix of the English aesthetic and rock and roll, it's a very powerful thing. And I think that really is at its peak with Led Zeppelin. They seem to be a direct integration of the two. If you take Led Zeppelin as a case study, we have a band that emerged in 1968-69, and it really is that British take on American blues and American psychedelic music, and that's pretty much what it is. When they start to do covers like of Joe Baez songs, and there's a Bert Jansch, you know, cover, although they titled it their own track, but on the first album you see the English aesthetics there. But even Zeppelin move towards it. And once they get to Led Zeppelin 3 and they truly integrate ideas that have really come from rock and roll through bands like Fairport Convention and the Incredible String Band and Pentangle, and when they integrate that into rock and roll and rock music on Led Zeppelin 3, they become a truly innovative rock band, which then pretty much takes over the world. This is, you can see happening. But of course, the more you integrate these ideas in, the more you move away from that visceral rock and roll magic, and that magic that you get when you mix visceral rock and roll with these English ideas, which, as I've explained, not only worked for King Crimson, not only worked for Jimi Hendrix, but also worked for Chaz and Dave, right? That's the magical mix. By the time you get to people like Mike Oldfield, you know, making Tubular Bells, they've moved so far away that no one's getting the feeling of that inclusive approach to music. That's gone. You know, young musicians that are coming up are buying Yes albums and just being astonished by what is achievable on those albums. You know, there's no way in that the very English inclusivity that I describe has gone. And I think the progressive rock world, they get to the limit of that around about 1973, right? And I think musicians that are coming up in the UK that have taken in this progressive rock project start to think, how can we bring that back to something which is more visceral? So when we get to the punk bands like the Stranglers and the Damned, and especially the Sex Pistols, which I'm going to talk about now, I don't see them as being a reaction against progressive rock. I see them as much more musicians that had grown up listening to that progressive experiment. You know, so someone like, you know, John Lydon is a fan of David Bowie. He's a fan of Captain Beefheart. He's a fan of Van de Graaff Generator, right? But what he's doing is he's taking, right, the rock and roll form. So when John Lydon hooks up with the guys at Sex Pistols, they pretty much just are a generic, you know, sort of garage rock band, and they've gone back to those American forms. They've listened to bands like MC5, that sort of much more simpler rock, because they haven't got the virtuosity. But what Lydon does, and this is John Lydon's real genius, is he then reintegrates back into that, like the progressive rock musicians, he reintegrates back into that visceral form these English ideas, right? So he's going to take a non-rhythm and blues vocal approach to his vocal. He's actually going to take his vocal approach from Peter Hamill from Van de Graaff Generator. Image-wise, he's going to create a character on stage which is hobbled, but holds up to a mirror up to culture and questions that culture. And that's going to come, and you've got to understand, the Lydon's a genius, but he's, again, like the Beatles, he's a working class genius. But he is erudite enough to have recognised certain things within English culture that he brings into his own performance. I see a lot of Richard III, especially Olivia's take on Richard III, in the way he moves and the way he rides, and the sort of beady-eyed glance in which he stares down the audience with that Nietzschean gaze, like Zarusha coming down from the mountains and spouting the truth through this hobbled character, which is hunched, you know, talking to camera, just like, you know, Olivia. I see those elements. And like John Lydon, because I just want to talk to him about him in terms of punk, he really takes on the English aesthetic, you know. And so when they go to number one and they're banned with God Save the Queen, they're questioning the whole enterprise of royalty in the British Empire. They're challenging that with nihilism, but they're also integrating the poetry of William Blake, you know, with that line about England's dreaming that you get. It's pure English poetry, and it's this challenge, it's this inclusive challenge, this sneer, which is actually on these albums here. It's what Peter Sellers is doing here, is what punk and the guys in those punk bands are doing. It's the same with the guys in the Damned. And I do not see this as being the polar opposite. You know, the polar opposite for me to prog is actually disco music. When disco emerged in the mid-70s, suddenly the record companies having huge hit records with people, you know, with songs that people can dance to. I think they looked around and then they looked at who they got on the record, you know, on their deals, and they sort of looked at Genesis and went, well, Genesis, you know, everyone's having hit records. You couldn't write something that people could dance to. And Genesis go, well, if we want to stay here, we don't want to get dumped, we better start doing this. I think that is far more the impetus for prog to change. I think punk, actually what punk does is it comes up and freshens up the progressive concept. And straight after punk has diminished, you see bands like Joy Division and The Cure emerge, which for me are as much prog as they are punk. And it's the progressive idea wound in. And throughout that, we have these English allusions coming back into the music all the way through. Now, I could go through the 80s and explain where the literary allusions and the English aesthetic is in Kate Bush's music, or where it is in, say, ABC or Frankie Goes to Hollywood. And I think it's pretty self-evident. I would just be listing as something. But this sort of anarchic, revolutionary, inclusive, anarchistic thing that's in the English aesthetic that we see put into punk, and we see emerged in bands like New Model Army, we see it in the bands like the Levellers. I'm talking about that aspect, this anarchistic aspect that I tried to show you on the with that track right at the start of this video, right? I want to track that through into another area where English musicians and British musicians have taken over the world, right? In the mid-80s, a movement again emerged in America. It had come out of disco, the very thing I'm talking about. You know, people are having parties, and within gay clubs in America, in what they call the warehouse, you know, movement, we have DJs playing disco records and then creating a very visceral version of disco with samplers and sequencers. And this is the beginning of house music, techno. Right, and this is a music that is designed for small sort of alternative parties, you know, that's grown out of the disco scene in America. These records start to have an effect, and they start to go around in much the same way as, you know, Little Richard albums start to crop up in Liverpool. You know, out of the hands of sailors into the hands of the Beatles. You know, that thing is these records start to crop up in the UK. And the UK decide to emulate, as they did in the early 60s, to emulate what's going on in America, and they start to run parties, and sort of some DJs have success with that, right? But a very English anarchistic thing happens at that point, is the powers that be, they don't like this, and they try and shut this down. This is in the late 80s, early 90s. And so people, that sort of revolutionary anarchistic spirit which is in the English people, the individuality of saying, you're not going to get this, we're not going to do this, they take it out. And where do they take it? They take it out of the warehouse and they take it into the English countryside. And before you know it, you suddenly have these huge raves popping up with people setting up the stage in the middle of nowhere in a secret location. Then they wouldn't tell anybody, and then at the last minute, you know, they would tell a whole bunch of people to meet at a service station in the middle of the night, and, you know, everyone's chatting to each other on these great big mobile phones that had just come out. You know, come to the service station on the M4, and all these people would turn up, and then they'd be given an address, and they'd drive out, and they would find that out of nowhere they would legally they had set up this huge stage, this huge sound system, and they would start to play this dance music, and this great party would start up. And the government, how do we stop this? How can we stop this? And a war starts up. You know, government legislation is brought out to stop this. If anyone's ever listened to the masterpiece, which is Music for a Jilted Generation by Prodigy, which when it came out of vinyl had a gatefold you can open up, and inside that was a big picture of a bunch of ravers having a rave, and a bunch of police on the other side of a sort of ravine with a rope bridge, and then some hippie with a knife is about to cut the rope bridge, you know, stranding the police away while sticking his fingers up against authority, right? And these people took on this movement and people decided to turn away from the established way of living, just like I was describing with Tony Hancock on that film The Rebel. And we have these things called New Age Travellers, and New Age Travellers basically are like modern electric gypsies, and they're out there. And of course, once you have that, which is a million miles away from what's going on in the warehouse scene in America, you've got these huge raves with these New Age Travellers there, and they start to embrace these ideas of, nature, of the English countryside, of the pastoral, and they go back to those music forms, and suddenly these obscure progressive rock artists like Steve Hillage and Gong, they're brought into the fold, and you get bands like the Orb emerge, and the Orb are basically like a modern day version of Hawkwind and Gong. That whole thing that had been developed through the progressive rock scene that we saw emerge at Glastonbury in the early 70s is suddenly brought into this sort of dance music thing, and it all goes very prog. Of course, the money that's seen that can be made through this, and big business comes in, and companies like Cream then set this up as an official sort of brand, Ministry of Sound, and that sort of branded version of dance music then emerges out of Britain, and it then gets exported across the whole world. Right, now think about this. Here we champion on this channel, progressive rock music, but that scene's gone. Kids aren't cramming themselves on a Friday night to see the latest progressive rock band blow their minds at, like the UFO Club or whatever it is. They don't do it anymore. Every single town has its corporate, nightclub, which is playing a sort of Ministry of Sound Cream approved version of dance music. All right, and this is across the whole world. That modern music scene, which has completely changed the music scene. You see, if you're an artist now, if you could get a track out on the internet, doesn't matter whether you've got a deal or not, if that gets picked up by DJs and they start playing it in clubs, you can have a worldwide hit. That is the way the modern music industry works. And that very thing has grown out of Britain. It's not an American thing. Here we are changing the world again in terms of the modern music industry. And it's the subfusion of this English aesthetic into this very American sort of techno house music scene that has created this. This has happened over and over again. Out of that very sort of electronic, computerized pop music world that has been created out of that, which has basically taken over the music scene for the past 20 odd years, steps in a very English, young gentleman called Ed Sheeran, who decides to take all those influences, take all the looping and all the electronic stuff, but bring back the acoustic guitar. And whether you like him or not, Ed Sheeran is there now, ruling the world, one of the biggest artists in the world. We have done this continually from the beginning of the 1960s to now, right? And it is the integration of these ideas, it's the integrations that come from the English aesthetic, So I want to just finish up this video. Now I've tried to make my case for how this has happened all the way through music history, and it's still happening now. I want to discuss how much that is under threat at the moment. Anybody who's watching this channel that's outside the UK, who is responding to my sort of Anglophile discussion here, and this, I've had so many people message me saying, I'm not from the UK, but I know exactly what you're talking about. I love this thing. I picked it up when I first saw the Fawlty Towers, or I picked it up when I first listened to the Beatles, and I've always loved it, and I've had so many comments. And I don't think it's because these aesthetic things represent colonialism or empire. It's quite the opposite, and I've had to have a few arguments that I am not discussing that. All cultures, right, invaded and pillaged. All cultures committed atrocities, right across the board, right. There is a few cultures that spotted that and stopped it. And Western liberal democracy is one of them, and especially here in this country. If you blame England for what it did in the past, you need to blame all cultures for doing that. And I'm on about all cultures. If you've got a technologically advanced country like the UK, which has happened because of industry, which has happened because of enlightenment, the mechanisation of the atrocities we can commit is greater. right? But I don't think, right, because I am not a fan of identity politics whatsoever. I'm not a fan of neo-Marxism whatsoever. And I think we need a strong argument against that thinking that will, corner off, English culture and put it in the sort of white supremacist narrative, that this is really that all English art is just a summation of a meta-narrative created by white supremacy to maintain their privilege, right? This is absolute nonsense. And it is fundamentally, it's the re-entry of the tribalism, right? Which tribalism is linked directly to identity. It's a re-entry of that into the discourse, which for me is primarily prejudiced, is primarily racist. Okay, for me. And I will return to these elements that I think in the English aesthetic, which is the idea of not believing you are morally, correct. That there being a question there of believing in fair play, a liberal idea of letting people want to do what they want to do, of tolerance, of letting people have free speech, all these things which I think, and there are in other cultures as well. Believe I'm not just saying it's only in English culture, but I think it's those ideas that are then within these art forms, and when they go out into the world, it's those things that people respond to, and it gives them a warm feeling in their heart to pick up on that. And I think fundamentally that is embodied within the English countryside. I think the imagery of that, because the history of England and this tussle between totalitarian and the God-given right of the king, and then the view and voice of the people, this tussle which is so apparent in English history, is wrought into the landscape. Nature exists at one with a patchwork of fields and small villages, which really show the integration, I think, of humanity, like democratic humanity, free will and free speech within nature. And I think for our culture to move forward, we are going to have to wind ourselves in and consider how we exist in nature. A lot of the discourse that's around about climate change at the moment, there is this idea that we have caused climate change and we can fix climate change, right? That we are somehow destroying the planet. We're not destroying the planet, we're destroying ourselves. We need to wind ourselves in, and these huge, horrible, dogmatic, fixed ideologies that can't be questioned, right, only try and, preserve an elitist way of thinking which pushes us human beings as being at the top of some triangle of hierarchy. And we're absolutely not. Right, and I think there's something in the English aesthetic, especially with our the love of the English landscape, that posits you back into that. And every true Englishman and Englishwoman really is at their most happiest walking a dog, with a packet of Walker's plain crisps, walking through the landscape, the English landscape, what we have out here, which is a sort of fair to middling, drizzly day. There's something that warms the cockles of every English person, and I think it is picked up by people all over the world. So that thing which I think is so powerful, and I have had a little bit of a rant there, and I was going to have that rant on the next video, but believe me, I'm going to have that rant on the next video. Don't worry, I am really going to hit back at these ideas. But on this one, where we really try to discuss how it's integrated into music, I cannot tell you how much this thing that... So let me go back to what I was saying early on. If you are not in the UK and you watch this video and say, I know what you mean, Andy, I know what you're saying about the English culture, and that's the thing you know about England. That's the thing you know about Britain. That's our export to the world, right? Here in the UK, we can get all bogged down in our English worries and all that stuff. But in terms of the world, it's our art and our music and our culture that has actually gone out and spread across the whole landscape. I cannot tell you how much that is under threat at the moment. Us pulling out of Brexit has made it really difficult for UK touring musicians, and more importantly, the people that put on tours, you know, the road crew, the sound, the hiring companies, which basically were the best in the world, are now no longer able to facilitate touring as they once did. And there's an incredible open letter that was posted out by a UK drummer called Steve Barney, where he really explained how he'd lost his gig with Anastasia just because he is a British musician. Right, that is under threat. But also there has been the rise of the elites here. Right, and when I talk about identity politics, I see identity politics as the weapon of the elites. It's the dogma of the elite. You know, when you put on the television, you know, they are pumping out these dogmas to you. It's not if it was an alternative view that was questioning the status quo, which I think most liberals think it is, I would be all for it, but it's not. It's something that cannot be questioned, and it's written in to our culture in so many ways. So when I start to talk about, you know, British comedy, and I start to talk about you know, British art, there's a discussion going on right now that about the fact that certain aspects of the British comedy Fawlty Towers has been edited out by the BBC. There are people apparently with such high moral standing that they have been given a position to cut things out of a television programme that I've been watching since I was a child because it's bad for me to hear the words in that. Even though the artists involved with that are brilliantly, and it's been proved to be brilliant, are brilliantly subverting and showing up racism. Right? Showing up for how ridiculous it is. But apparently we live in an ideological world that even though they're doing that and they know their intentions are honourable, we just should not be allowed to hear those words full stop. And they have been cut out. And all the left-wing liberals who say, oh, this cancel culture doesn't exist, this been edited out. It's been edited out. It has been edited out. Right? And the same thing is going on with the books of Roald Dahl. Apparently there's stuff that we cannot hear as in that at all. You know, there's these elites, these people who run the world, you know, the Rishi Sunaks, you know, they're these multi-millionaires that I have to say have inherently are less privileged than me because Rishi Sunak is not a white European middle-aged male. Well, I can hold up my cards and tell you that my mom's Indian and I do have some mixed heritage there. So does that buy me back a few privilege points? Right? But no, we have got to turn around and then say that it doesn't matter how privileged that guy is and how much he spouts his identity politics because he has to. It's the weapon of the elites. Right? It's a weapon of the elites. It's there to shut us up and stop questioning stuff. It's there to make them look like they are helping the underprivileged as they help people that they have been, you know, platonically embodied with a lack of privilege. Right? The worst thing you could be at the moment in our culture is a very poor white person. Because if you accept what identity politics says, a white person just has an inherent privilege, right? Perhaps they do, in some aspect they do, but if you're a very poor, you know, single mother, you know, trying to feed your children through whatever methods you can, you know, that tiny little bit of privilege is probably pretty much hidden from you. We need to start looking after people. Anyway, the reason I say this is because what I see within the arts is the activity of being creative is being cordoned off to those elites, right? And funding for music courses, for art courses, the remit of what those courses do, how many hours they have, you know, the access they have to equipment, to education, to teaching. I'm a music teacher. I teach within the college, which is publicly funded, and then I teach privately. And I can't help but thinking that the kids that arrive to me that are paying a lot of money per hour, right? have a privilege and access to music which other kids that I see don't have. And I see the widening going on in terms of who is allowed to make creative stuff here in this country. And here I am, I've just been championing a whole history of where this country has punched above its weight by allowing certain people with a certain worldview, I don't want to call them underprivileged, but people with a certain worldview, access to the creative party, whether it is the Beatles, whether it is the Sex Pistols, whether it is all these people that made dance music, whether it is Oasis, whether it is like Madness or the Specials or whatever it is, you know, whoever it is, and all those middle class, you know, art school educated, they're allowed in too. We want them all. We want everybody in. We want everybody in on this. Right, but at the moment here in the UK, there is a widening, and it's as though, you know, the world has gone, well, we have the people to feed the arts, and they're going to come from the hyper-privileged people. You know, and as long as we're checking quotas and making sure there's enough gay people and trans people and black people in that, then by doing that, we can prove that we're inclusive. Whilst working class people and poor people and people without jobs have not got a chance to express themselves whatever. But that does not matter, because the quotas show that we are, you know, embodying equity in our artistic program. A lot of what I've just covered, I wanted to cover on the next video. And so this may be the second and final part of my excursion into the English aesthetic, because I think over this video, I think I've got to do the three things I wanted, which was sort of define what I call the English aesthetic, and then describe its integration into music, and then really take on these sort of political problems that I see at the moment and just speak up. If anyone's seriously upset with what I've said, look, this is the very point, right? Hopefully we still live in a world where I can come on to a public platform, I haven't sworn, I haven't said anything offensive, and give you my opinion about this. If I could well be wrong, this is the whole thing about this English aesthetic. I could be wrong. Some of the ideas might be misplaced. I am willing to have a civilized conversation, and I will change my point of view. I will change my point of view. When the whole Brexit thing happened in the UK, I went from being very left-wing to moving over to being quite right-wing, as I thought. I felt like the left were not looking after the underprivileged. I suddenly went, oh God, this socialist idea is just corrupt. It's just corrupt. It's as corrupt as what the right-wingers are doing. And I can feel myself shifting. But more recently, talking to people on the left and realising, you know, the completely honourable and decent wants that most left-wing people have, which is to redistribute, you know, wealth so that people don't starve and that they can express themselves and live in a decent society, has brought me back over to the left. So I am not a dogmatically ideological person, but I am very angry at the things I see at the moment within the arts, and yet the right wing will always, in the end, it's their nature to look after big business, to look after money, and to look after themselves. And there's a part of me, the sort of liberal, that goes, we need that done to a certain extent. What we need is balance. This is the whole problem with our culture at the moment. That sense of balance, right? And I've been talking about balance all the way. The balance that is embodied when you walk out into the English countryside, which is not just pure nature and is not just pure urban. It's a mixture of the two. It's a beautiful mixture. That sense of balance that we can see in nature, we all need to be moving towards. That's so important culturally that we can do that. I really feel I have now got to the end of this video. I hope you enjoyed it. You know, I'll be keeping a beady eye on my subscriber numbers, you know, to see if anyone's been so upset that they decided to unsubscribe. But you have to have an opinion, don't you? You have to say what you think, and that's what I think. And anybody who watches the channel will see that these ideas are always bubbling underneath, you know. If you want to call me a colonialist or a racist, you're welcome to, but I will be arguing back anyway. I think we're at the end. We're done. If you did like this video, please like it. If you want to hear more of this sort of ranty stuff, then put it in the comments and I will do it, and subscribe and I will do more of it. If you want to get into the real nooks and crannies of what I do and what I'm into and what I'm about, and also the wider things that I'm doing musically and a whole bunch of stuff, there is an absolute ton of content over on my Patreon now. If you go and pay your £5 a month, you know, you will be there for a long time to try and get through it all. There is an absolute mountain of stuff. You know, I'm putting up as much stuff there as I put up here. You know, so I think I'm coming up to around about 80 videos, you know, long form videos there now. Anyway, I'm going to go now. Thanks for watching. We're up against the hour and I must go. I'll see you on the next video. Bye.